In the shadow of the 1893 Chicago World's Fair, a man named H. Holmes built a strange building that the press would later call a murder castle. Some say it was filled with hidden rooms, trapdoors, and unsettling secrets that shocked the nation. I'm about to take you through the story that has haunted history for over a century. You're watching Eternal Obsidian. Subscribe now to step deeper into the world's darkest legends. Herman Webster Mudgett was born on May 16, 1861, in the small New England town of Gilmanton, New Hampshire. He came into a world of modest farms, tight-knit communities, and stern religious discipline. His parents, Levi Horton Mudgett and Theodate Page Price, were devout Methodists who believed in hard work and moral order. Levi painted houses and farmed to support the family, while Theodate kept the household and cared for their 5 children. Herman was the third child, born between older siblings Ellen and Arthur, and followed by Henry and Mary. Later generations would claim that the boy's childhood was marked by cruelty and violence, that he was beaten or terrorized into the twisted life he eventually lived. Yet there is no contemporary evidence to support those stories. The records that survive suggest instead that he was raised in a strict but stable home, a boy of intelligence who simply stood apart from his peers. At school, Herman showed himself to be unusually gifted in mathematics and science. Teachers remembered his sharp mind, while classmates saw him as distant and often arrogant. Local legends claimed that he once had a terrible fear of skeletons, until older boys forced him to confront one in a doctor's office, an experience that supposedly sparked his fascination with anatomy. That tale comes only from Holmes himself, written years later when he was facing the gallows, and there is no way to know whether it was ever true. What can be said with certainty is that he gravitated early toward medicine and dissection, skills that would later give him both prestige and opportunity. By the age of 16, he had graduated from Gilmanton Academy, one of the better schools in the region. Like many educated young men, he tried his hand at teaching in nearby towns, but he disliked the work. Farming and labor never suited him, and he yearned for wealth and sophistication far beyond what small New Hampshire villages could offer. At just 17 years old, he married Clara Lovering, the daughter of a prosperous local farmer. The marriage was recorded in town registers, and before long the couple had a son, Robert. Herman's charm initially impressed Clara's family, but the relationship quickly soured. Clara would later describe him as abusive and dishonest. Within a few years, he abandoned both her and their child, drifting away in search of something greater. This was also the period when he began his first confirmed swindles. He took out small insurance policies and attempted to cash them by faking deaths, sometimes using animals in place of human bodies. He borrowed freely and repaid little, leaving creditors behind as he moved from place to place. These schemes did not make him rich, but they revealed a pattern that would become his lifelong habit: deception as a way of life. In 1882, Herman enrolled at the University of Michigan's Department of Medicine and Surgery in Ann Arbor. The records of the school confirm his enrollment and his graduation 2 years later. Fellow students remembered him as intelligent, especially skilled in anatomy, but also notorious for trickery. Rumors circulated that he had stolen cadavers from the school laboratory, selling them to other institutions or using them in insurance scams. One story, supported by police notes though never proven in court, held that he once insured a cadaver, presented it as the body of a man who had died in an accident, and attempted to collect the payout. The company refused, and Holmes slipped away before charges could be filed. When he received his degree in 1884, he possessed both legitimate medical knowledge and a growing confidence in fraud. His ambitions were far greater than the small towns of New England could contain. Soon he was drifting again, this time to larger cities where opportunity and anonymity made his schemes easier to carry out. He first surfaced in Philadelphia, working briefly in a drugstore. While there, a young boy died after taking medicine Holmes had dispensed. No charges were ever filed, and the matter faded quickly, but Holmes abandoned the city in haste. In New York, he presented himself as a doctor, though records suggest his practice was little more than a front while he searched for easier profits. By the mid-1880s, Herman Webster Mudgett had begun calling himself Dr. Henry Howard Holmes. The name lent him an air of refinement, an identity that distanced him from his rural roots and hinted at the respectable professional he pretended to be. In reality, the man who would later be remembered as America's first serial killer had already begun to weave together a life of deception, crime, and ambition. When Herman Webster Mudgett left the East behind and reappeared in Chicago in 1886, he was no longer the young medical graduate struggling to find a foothold. He had reinvented himself as Dr. Henry Howard Holmes, a name that carried an air of sophistication and mystery. Chicago at the time was a city in transformation. The railroads had turned it into one of the nation's busiest hubs, its population soaring toward 1 million. Opportunity was everywhere, but so was anonymity. A man like Holmes could disappear into its crowded streets and emerge with a reputation of his own making. Holmes found work at a drugstore in Englewood, a neighborhood just south of the city's booming downtown. The pharmacy belonged to an older widow named Elizabeth Holton. According to contemporary accounts, Holmes presented himself as a polite and capable young doctor, impressing Mrs. Holton and her customers alike. Later myths claimed that Mrs. Holton vanished under suspicious circumstances, murdered so Holmes could seize her store. In truth, census records and later writings prove that she lived well into the 20th century. The truth was more ordinary. Holmes simply worked there, gained her trust, and established himself in the community. Not long after his arrival, Holmes turned his ambitions toward property. Across the street from the drugstore stood a vacant lot, and Holmes saw potential in it. Using a mixture of charm, deception, and credit he never intended to repay, he acquired control of the property. City records from the late 1880s show him arranging construction of a 2-story building. The first floor would contain retail shops, including a new drugstore under his name. The second floor offered apartments for rent. Holmes borrowed heavily from suppliers to finance the construction, ordering goods on credit and often refusing to pay once the deliveries were made. Several lawsuits against him from this period survive in Cook County records, showing his habit of leaving creditors empty-handed. As the building took shape, Holmes developed a reputation as a landlord and businessman. He hired and fired contractors frequently, often refusing to pay them in full. When they pressed him for money, he threatened lawsuits of his own or simply replaced them with others. By constantly rotating his workers, he prevented anyone from knowing the full design of the building. This later gave rise to the legend of the Murder Castle, a structure of secret rooms, staircases that led nowhere, and trapdoors into hidden chambers. There is truth in the fact that the building contained unusual features, false walls, hidden closets, and concealed spaces, but historians caution that most of these were the result of Holmes' constant construction changes, intended to confuse creditors rather than hide murder. In 1890, Holmes added a 3rd floor, planning to turn it into a hotel for visitors who would soon arrive for the 1893 World's Columbian Exposition. Newspapers of the time confirmed that construction was underway, but again creditors lined up, unpaid and angry. Still, the building itself stood as a testament to Holmes' ambition. Part business front, part residence, and, as later evidence would show, a place where several people disappeared. During these years, Holmes also continued the habits that had marked his earlier life: fraud, manipulation, and charm used as weapons. He lured investors into schemes that never materialized, persuaded suppliers to extend him credit, and charmed women who often ended up abandoned or worse. Among them was Myrta Belknap, a woman from Minnesota whom he married in 1887, despite still being legally wed to Clara Lovering in New Hampshire. Myrta and Holmes had a daughter, Lucy, but the marriage was as troubled as his first. Holmes moved Myrta into the suburb of Wilmette, where she lived quietly with their child, while he kept his business and affairs in Chicago. It was in Chicago that Holmes' double life took firmer shape. To the public, he was Dr. Holmes, the respectable proprietor of a pharmacy and a growing business empire. To those who knew him more closely, he was manipulative, deceitful, and increasingly dangerous. Reports began to surface of young women who entered his orbit and never returned. Many of them were employees, drawn by the promise of steady work in his store or building. Others were romantic interests who trusted his charm. While exact numbers are uncertain, Several disappearances from this period were later linked to Holmes through testimony and investigation. At the same time, he cultivated a reputation as a man of refinement. He dressed well, spoke with confidence, and carried himself like a gentleman. Creditors who attempted to pursue him found themselves entangled in endless legal disputes. Business partners who trusted him often lost everything. His skills as a liar and manipulator were so practiced by now that he could spin any setback into an advantage. By the early 1890s, Holmes was firmly entrenched in Chicago life. His building in Englewood stood 3 stories tall, his pharmacy prospered, and his name carried weight in the neighborhood. Beneath that surface, however, the foundation was built on fraud, theft, and, as investigators would later uncover, murder. The world's Columbian Exposition was approaching, a spectacle that would draw millions to Chicago from across the nation and the world. Holmes was preparing his building to profit from the influx of visitors. In doing so, he was also creating the stage for the crimes that would make him infamous. By the early 1890s, the building at 63rd and Wallace in Englewood had taken on a shape unlike most others in the neighborhood. Holmes' original 2-story structure now had a 3rd floor, giving it the appearance of a small hotel. The lower level contained storefronts and his pharmacy, while the upper floors were partitioned into rooms and apartments. To the people of Englewood, it was simply known as the Holmes Building. The label Murder Castle would not appear until years later, after his arrest, when newspapers were competing to outdo one another with tales of horror. The strange reputation of the building grew partly from Holmes' own way of dealing with contractors. Because he hired and dismissed workers so frequently, none ever saw the full plans. Blueprints were altered mid-construction. Walls were added or removed, stairways led to bricked-off spaces, and doors opened into empty corridors. The result was a floor plan that looked confusing and even suspicious to outsiders. To creditors, the changes were a smokescreen. To later journalists, they were evidence of hidden chambers for murder. What can be said with certainty is that the building contained unusual features. Court filings and later testimony describe windowless rooms, oddly angled hallways, and chutes that led from upper floors to the basement. Holmes explained these as conveniences for storage and housekeeping. Later writers painted them as death traps. The truth likely lies in between. The chutes, for instance, were real, but whether they were designed for disposing of bodies or simply for trash remains unproven. In the basement, police who investigated the building in 1895 found work tables, a furnace, and containers of chemicals. These were interpreted as tools for stripping flesh from skeletons, which Holmes could then sell to medical schools. This claim carries some credibility. Holmes had anatomical training, and at least one medical school did later confirm receiving a skeleton traced to him. Yet the idea that the basement was a vast laboratory of torture, with vats of acid and racks of surgical equipment, is largely an invention of the press. Reporters described lurid scenes that grew more elaborate with each retelling, but when historians examined the actual police inventory, the items listed were consistent with a small medical workshop, not a horror chamber. During the early 1890s, the building operated openly as a business. The first floor shops rented space and Holmes collected rent. The second and third floors held apartments, occupied mostly by young single women who worked in the city. Many of them were employed by Holmes himself as clerks, stenographers, or assistants. Several of these women disappeared during this period, their fates never fully explained. That fact alone gave later writers reason to suspect the building was more than it seemed. The world's Columbian Exposition in 1893 added another layer to the story. Holmes advertised that his building could house visitors to the fair, though how many actually stayed there is uncertain. Records do not show a functioning hotel with guests coming and going in large numbers. Instead, it seems Holmes rented out rooms irregularly, while continuing to use the building for his pharmacy and for his own offices. The vision of throngs of fairgoers checking into a hotel designed as a murder machine is, again, a product of later sensationalism. What is undeniable, however, is that several women last seen with Holmes never appeared again. Some were his employees, others his lovers. Names like Julia Connor, Emmeline Sigrand, and Minnie and Nanny Williams surface repeatedly in surviving records. Their disappearances were real, their ties to Holmes undeniable, and investigators later traced them back to the Englewood building. Whether they died in hidden rooms or elsewhere, the building became central to the case against him because it was the last place many of them were known to be alive. When police searched the structure after Holmes' arrest in 1894, they were confronted with its bizarre design. Reporters who followed them inside described it in language better suited to a Gothic novel than a newspaper. Trapdoors, secret staircases, padded rooms, and gas pipes running into chambers were all written about. Some of these features existed, others were exaggerated, and some were wholly invented. Later demolition records show that the building, though strange, was not the elaborate torture palace described in headlines. Holmes himself did little to dispel the stories. When confronted, he alternated between denial, amusement, and vague admissions. In his written confession, much of which was proven false, he encouraged the legend by describing murders in the building that could not be verified. By the time his trial began, the murder castle had become a fixture of popular imagination, and the facts of its construction and use were almost drowned out by the myths. In truth, the Englewood building was many things at once: a pharmacy, a business block, a lodging house, and a center of Holmes' fraud schemes. It was also the site connected to several disappearances that would never be solved. But the image of a labyrinth of torture rooms designed for industrial-scale killing is the creation of sensational newspapers eager to sell copies. The real building was less theatrical, but in its ordinariness lay the true horror. It was not a castle of nightmares, but a respectable business block where trust was betrayed. Lives were taken quietly, and the line between commerce and crime blurred beyond recognition. By the time the World's Fair came and went in 1893, the circle around H. Holmes included business partners, clerks, tenants, and a succession of young women who worked for him or were romantically involved with him. Several of those women disappeared. Later accounts inflated those disappearances into a death toll impossible to verify. What can be traced with confidence are the people whose last known movements intersected with Holmes and the investigations that followed. The clearest case, because it produced a body, an autopsy, a jury verdict, and a sentence, was the murder of Benjamin F. Pittesel in Philadelphia in 1894. Pittesel had been Holmes's collaborator in a long series of cons, including an insurance scheme that required Pittesel to assume an alias and fake his own death so a $10,000 policy could be paid out. Instead of staging a death, Holmes turned it into a real one. Pittesel's burned corpse was found in a rented office, and at first glance it appeared to be the result of an accident. The coroner's autopsy and expert testimony made the difference. The evidence of chloroform, the timing and distribution of which did not match an accidental death, supported the prosecution's case that Pittesel had been killed before the fire. On that basis, a Philadelphia jury convicted Holmes of murder in 1895. This is the one homicide for which there is a legal conviction. From that point forward, the investigation widened beyond Philadelphia. Holmes had taken charge of 3 of Pittesel's children, Alice, Nellie, and Howard, under the pretense of reuniting them with their mother while moving them from city to city under false names. The casework of Detective Frank P. Geyer of Philadelphia, documented in his contemporary account of the pursuit, became the backbone of what is known with certainty. Tracking receipts, hotel ledgers, and witness statements, Geyer followed Holmes's path through the Midwest into Canada. In Toronto, police excavated the cellar of a house Holmes had rented and recovered the remains of 2 girls. The girls' identities were established through clothing and personal effects. The timing, the travel records, and Geyer's docket tied the remains to Alice and Nellie Pittesel. Howard, the youngest, never reached Toronto. Geyer's trail led to a rented house in the Irvington neighborhood of Indianapolis, where investigators recovered charred bone fragments and other physical traces consistent with the murder of a child. These recoveries, 2 in Toronto, 1 in Indianapolis, do not rely on Holmes's later fabrications. They rest on police searches, physical evidence, and contemporaneous reports. Taken together with the Philadelphia autopsy, they form the 4 deaths that can be treated as established in the record: Benjamin, Alice, Nellie, and Howard Pittesel. Around the same period, the Chicago disappearances that had long been whispered about began to receive closer scrutiny. Julia Smythe, often recorded as Julia Connor after marriage, worked in Holmes's building. She and her young daughter Pearl vanished around Christmas 1891. Julia's husband, a jeweler who had been in business with Holmes, separated from her before the disappearance. No remains were recovered, and no indictment was ever brought for their deaths. Their absence from the historical record after their last documented association with Holmes, coupled with Holmes's later unreliable claims, leaves them in the category of strongly suspected victims, not legally proven ones. Emmeline Sigrand, a trained stenographer, took work with Holmes in 1892 and was soon reported missing by acquaintances. What survives are employment traces, witness statements about her association with Holmes, and then a silence in the record. Later writers pointed to a skeleton supplied to a medical school and speculated a connection. There is no conclusive forensic link in the surviving documents. As with Julia and Pearl, Emmeline's last confirmed movements were within Holmes's orbit, and then she disappears from public records. In 1893, Minnie Anna Williams arrived in Chicago from Texas, where she had inherited property. Paperwork from the period shows that she transferred control of some assets to men using names that can be connected to Holmes's web of aliases. Her sister Nanny, often recorded as Annie, came north soon after. Both sisters dropped out of sight later that year. Their property transactions and their documented association with Holmes are part of the case files. There is no recovery of remains and no conviction linked to their disappearances. The Fort Worth episode, in which Holmes attempted yet another building scheme and was later indicted in Texas on fraud-related charges, closely follows the transfer of the Williams sisters' assets, which is why investigators kept returning to their names. The evidence is documentary rather than forensic. There were other names that reached the papers in the 1890s and early 1900s, sometimes based on relatives' inquiries or on a boarding house rumor, sometimes on Holmes's own shifting confessions. Many of those claims do not withstand comparison with birth, marriage, and census records or cannot be reconciled with travel timelines and receipts that are otherwise solid. Even in the murder castle searches in Chicago in 1895, what police actually seized, items consistent with a small medical workshop, women's clothing, personal effects, had probative value but did not amount to a definitive body count from that building. The Chicago structure's confusing layout and the volume of sensational reporting created an image of mass murder that the inventories and court exhibits do not confirm. When the building was later damaged by fire and eventually demolished, the chance for deeper physical corroboration narrowed further. The arrest that brought Holmes within reach was not initially for murder. Pinkerton detectives apprehended him in Boston in November 1894 on a warrant tied to horse theft in Texas, a byproduct of his Fort Worth frauds. Once he was in custody and his insurance dealings came under examination, the Philadelphia case ripened into a homicide prosecution. The unraveling of the children's trail, through Geyer's methodical work, transformed public understanding of the man they already suspected in a string of disappearances. It also underlined how Holmes operated. He used overlapping scams, aliases, and jurisdictional gaps to keep creditors separated from one another and investigators one step behind. Holmes's own statements are of limited use for establishing facts. In 1896, he published a confession that listed dozens of killings, but multiple named victims in that account were later found alive or could be shown to have died under different circumstances. Where his words align with independent evidence, the Pitzel fraud, the custody and movement of the children, they help fill in sequence and motive. Where they stand alone, they are unreliable. For that reason, the list of confirmed victims is short and anchored to recovered remains and court outcomes, while the list of likely victims includes people whose documented proximity to Holmes is clear and whose disappearance from independent records is otherwise unexplained. The investigations also reveal the limits of late 19th century policing. There was no centralized national database to share missing person notices. Identification depended on clothing, dentistry, and personal effects, and interstate coordination was slow and dependent on letters and rail schedules. Against that backdrop, the Philadelphia trial stands out for its relatively rigorous forensic testimony about cause of death, and the Toronto and Indianapolis recoveries stand out for the fact of recovered bodies and the chain of custody linking those discoveries to Holmes's movements. These are the pieces that remain stable after more than a century of re-examination. As the case moved toward trial and then sentencing in Philadelphia, Chicago authorities continued to sift through what could be established locally. Creditor suits, property records, witness statements about tenants and employees who had stopped writing home. What emerged was not a definitive census of the dead, but a profile of method and opportunity. Holmes put himself in positions of trust as an employer, landlord, and suitor. He controlled properties where people could come and go without notice. He manipulated paperwork to redirect assets, and when necessary, he used his medical knowledge to conceal a death or dispose of a body. The serial killer label that later attached to him reflects patterns that investigators could see, but the historical record, conservative in its claims, rests on the murders of Benjamin, Alice, Nellie, and Howard Pittezel, the strongest and best documented part of a larger, darker story in which other disappearances remain unproven but plausible. The world's Columbian Exposition of 1893 remade Chicago in the public imagination. It brought the city fame, money, and an unprecedented flow of strangers. Architects, laborers, tourists, entertainers, and vendors moving through rail depots and boarding houses by the tens of thousands. The fair opened in the spring and ran through the autumn of 1893, attracting roughly 27 million visits by contemporaneous counts. For many Chicagoans, it was a bonanza. For others, it was dislocation. A season when the ordinary rules of neighborhood life loosened and transient populations layered over long-standing communities. Herman Webster Mudgett, by then calling himself Dr. H. Holmes, saw the fair as an opportunity. He had expanded his Englewood property into a 3-story business block and had, on occasion, described the upper floors as lodging for visitors. Contemporary advertisements and hotel lists from the period show homes presenting rooms for rent. Whether those rooms hosted large numbers of fairgoers, however, is another matter. There is no surviving ledger proving a busy, formal hotel with steady guest rolls during the fair months. Holmes's occupancy patterns appear irregular. Occasional rentals, short stays, and a mix of tenants who were both local workers and travelers. The idea of throngs of Columbian Exposition visitors sleeping in a purpose-built hotel on Wallace Street is a later dramatic image not supported by the administrative traces that remain. What the fair did provide was an expanded pool of vulnerable people. Single women traveled to Chicago seeking work, clerical positions, sales work on fair concessions, and other opportunities opened up by the exposition's demand. Temporary laborers arrived in need of lodging. Transient tradesmen passed through looking for quick cash. In a city of that scale, a smooth, ingratiating man with the appearance of a physician and the convenience of rented rooms could meet new acquaintances and place them, briefly, under his control without raising immediate alarm. Investigators who later reconstructed Holmes's movements pointed to the coincidence of several disappearances with the fair period, and the timing became part of the pattern detectives examined. Press coverage of the time seized on that coincidence and amplified it. Chicago newspapers and national wires found in the fair an irresistible frame, a monstrous predator exploiting the international spectacle. Reporters described mysterious lodgings full of women who vanished, casting Holmes as a shadowy figure preying upon the crowds. Those contemporaneous articles brought readers vivid scene and moral outrage, but they often blurred fact and rumor. When later historians compared the newspapers with court files, police inventories, and municipal records, many of the most sensational claims could not be verified. The press had reported padded rooms, electric bells to control victims, and an organized steady stream of human prey during fair weeks. Police inventories and building plans showed an odd, reworked building but not the elaborate mechanized devices the headlines promised. Investigators worked within the limits of late 19th century policing. They collected witness statements, examined hotel and boarding house registers, and searched Holmes's property for physical evidence. Several women who had worked for or been associated with Holmes are last documented in the months around the fair. Their employment records, letters, and friends' affidavits place them in his orbit. Those documentary links are real. Where the record breaks is the physical proof that would turn suspicion into certain cause of death. Bodies, autopsies, or confessions corroborated by independent facts. For many of the women connected to Holmes, that corroboration is absent. Their disappearances remain documented gaps. People who stepped into Holmes's world and were never heard from again. Detectives, constrained by the state of forensic science and by the transient nature of fair populations, could do little more than map these absences and mark them for future inquiry. At the same time, solid investigative work was proceeding elsewhere that would prove more decisive than rumor. The Philadelphia insurance fraud and the Pitzel children case, events that unfolded after the fair, brought detectives into Holmes's past and exposed his methods. Aliases, staged deaths, forged receipts, and the transfer of children and property under false pretenses. That method, combining paperwork, mobility, and exploitation of anonymity, helped explain why the fair years look suspicious in hindsight. Holmes's travel receipts, train manifests, and hotel stubs, assembled after his arrest, show a man on the move in the early 1890s. Present in Chicago when the exposition drew crowds, absent at times when he was elsewhere on fraud business, and in constant contact with a web of associates and creditors. Those travel and financial traces are the kinds of evidence later investigators used to connect him to disappearances that had previously been no more than alarming rumors in newspaper columns. The fair's broader social context also mattered. Chicago's rapid growth strained municipal oversight. Boarding houses proliferated, regulation of lodging was uneven, and the sheer volume of visitors made it easier for people to slip through bureaucratic cracks. Families who lost contact with daughters working in the city often had no practical means to follow up across state lines. The infrastructure for missing person inquiries, formal cross-jurisdictional notices, centralized fingerprint records, or coordinated forensic labs did not exist. In that setting, a determined fraudster with medical knowledge and a talent for reinvention could operate with comparative impunity for years. Thus, the world's Columbian Exposition matters to Holmes's story not because it turned his Englewood building into an ironclad engine of murder, an image that belongs mostly to sensational journalism, but because it reshaped Chicago's population and provided conditions that assisted his pattern of deception. The fair increased the supply of potential victims who were traveling, trusting, and hard to trace. It provided cover for short-term rentals and for the movement of people between cities, and it supplied an eager press, hungry for scandal, willing to conflate suspicion and proof. When detective work later assembled receipts, ledgers, and witness statements into a chain that implicated Holmes in specific killings, it did so against the backdrop of those fair year anomalies. A man on the move in a city full of strangers, a building with hidden and reworked spaces, and a press that had already shaped public perception. Investigators and historians who separate contemporaneous reporting from documentary evidence find a cautionary lesson in that season. The fair magnified both opportunity and rumor. It left a trail of paperwork, not the lurid mechanical devices of later retellings, and it helped create the conditions that allowed Mudgett to blend exploitation, fraud, and occasional provable violence into a pattern that only later and piecemeal law enforcement would begin to unravel. Holmes's schemes had always mixed small-time fraud with a hunger for larger payouts, but by the mid-1890s, his operations had become brazenly complex and deadly. He did not kill at random. His crimes grew out of a pattern of financial deception, insurance frauds, forged documents, and the manipulation of associates whose trust he could weaponize. The strangest and most consequential of those relationships was with Benjamin Pitzel, a fellow con man whose fortunes and fate became entwined with Holmes's. Pitzel and Holmes first collaborated on schemes that aimed to cheat insurance companies. The plan they settled on was typical of their trade. One partner would assume a false identity and stage a death that could be presented to an insurer as accidental, thereby triggering a large payout. In the version that would lead to catastrophe, Pitzel agreed to fake his death so that Holmes could collect on a $10,000 life insurance policy. Instead of arranging a carefully staged hoax and splitting the proceeds, Holmes transformed the plan into real murder. In the summer of 1894, Benjamin Pitzel vanished. A search turned up a charred body in a burned room of a Philadelphia building. The condition of the remains and the circumstances of the fire left room for doubt about accidental death. The coroner and medical witnesses who examined the body concluded that chloroform had been used to render Pitzel unconscious prior to the fire, evidence central to the homicide charge. That forensic conclusion, together with other documentary traces that tied Holmes to the scene, provided the prosecution with a solid basis for charging him with murder. Holmes was ultimately tried in Philadelphia, and in 1895 a jury convicted him of Pitzel's murder. The Pitzel murder, however, was only the most straightforwardly provable killing connected to Holmes. The broader horror of the case lay in what happened to 3 of Pitzel's children. Alice, Nellie, and little Howard, whom Holmes had taken into his custody under pretense and then moved from city to city. The investigator whose work most dramatically broke the case open was Detective Frank P. Geyer of the Philadelphia Police. Geyer's method was painstakingly old-fashioned but effective. He followed paper. He traced hotel registers, railway receipts, telegrams, and other small business ledgers. He interviewed clerks, landlords, and innkeepers who had no reason to collude in a cover-up, and he kept a running, dated record of Holmes's movements and aliases. Geyer's trail led him across state lines into the Midwest and then into Canada. In Toronto, police searched a house Holmes had rented under an assumed name and uncovered the remains of 2 girls. Identification rested on clothing items, personal effects, and the chain of documentary evidence linking the girls' last known guardianship to Holmes and to Pitzel's family. In Indianapolis, investigators recovered charred bone fragments and other material consistent with the destruction of human remains. The context and timing connected those fragments to the missing young boy, Howard. Those physical recoveries, skeletons and fragments recovered by police and documented in official inventories, formed the concrete backbone of the accusations that linked Holmes to multiple homicides beyond Philadelphia. Holmes's tactics in the months before his arrest illuminate how he melded fraud and violence. He cultivated an array of aliases, often signing receipts and correspondence under different names to conceal his trail. He moved people, children, tenants, and associates, between cities where different court systems and local police forces operated with little coordination. He used convincing stories and forged documents to obtain custody of the Pitzel children and to persuade others to trust him. And when a scheme threatened discovery, he sometimes chose lethal measures over exposure. The documentary evidence assembled by detectives, receipts propping up timelines, hotel ledgers showing arrivals and departures under assumed names, correspondence bearing Holmes's hand, gave investigators the material means to follow him where witnesses alone could not. The arrest itself was anticlimactic in certain respects. Pinkerton operatives and local detectives captured Holmes in Boston in November 1894 on a complaint unrelated to murder. Charges connected to his frauds in Texas and to the theft of horses, part of a larger patchwork of indictments across jurisdictions. Once he was in custody, however, investigators in Philadelphia and elsewhere focused the spotlight. As reviews of his records and confessions progressed, they found corroboration for critical points in Geyer's chain of evidence. Holmes's own statements, sometimes boastful, sometimes self-protective, and often contradictory, helped to point detectives toward locations and transactions that could be checked. But the most durable discoveries were the material ones recovered by police and the forensic conclusions drawn from autopsies and examinations. Holmes's trial in Philadelphia presented a mix of modern forensic testimony for the era and the older forms of evidentiary proof. The coroner's analysis of Pitzel's burned body, witness accounts of Holmes's conduct and travel, and the paper trail Geyer and others had compiled. The jury's conviction reflected not only the homicide evidence but also the cumulative effect of Holmes's pattern of deception. His fate was sealed when he was sentenced to death. He was executed on May 7, 1896. Beyond the courtroom, Holmes faced a series of civil suits and indictments in multiple jurisdictions for fraud and forgery. Property records and creditor suits documented his long history of unpaid bills and swindled suppliers. Medical schools and collectors later confirmed that at least one skeleton they had purchased could be traced back to Holmes, lending credence to the theory that he sometimes sold remains for profit, an act that stood between fraud and a grisly commerce but did not by itself prove murder. Holmes's post-arrest confessions added to the public record but were unreliable where uncorroborated. He frequently named alleged victims who were later found alive or whose deaths could not be linked to him. Taken together, the insurance schemes, the Pitzel murder, the recovery of the Pitzel children's remains, and the documentation amassed by Geyer and others transformed suspicion into provable criminality. They showed a pattern. Holmes used financial deception and control of persons, particularly children and vulnerable women, as means to opportunity and, when necessary for his protection, to violence. The case also revealed the strengths and weaknesses of late 19th century police work. Dogged, paper-based detection could succeed where modern forensic science would later make the work more precise, but the lack of coordinated national records and standardized identification methods made it possible for a man like Holmes to operate across state lines for years. Holmes had published a written confession shortly before his execution. Printed in newspapers and pamphlets, it mixed factual admissions with wild exaggerations. In it, he claimed to have killed more than 24 people, sometimes even hinting at figures as high as 200. These numbers were unsubstantiated. Detectives, journalists, and later historians quickly demonstrated that many of the supposed victims Holmes named were alive and well, their survival confirmed by census records, marriage certificates, or later newspaper interviews. His tendency to boast and inflate served a purpose. He knew the press would amplify his story, and with the notoriety of his execution looming, he seemed eager to cast himself as larger than life. The Englewood building, the so-called murder castle, underwent a similar transformation in the public imagination. Contemporary newspapers referred to it as Holmes's Castle or Castle of Horrors, emphasizing its odd construction and his financial frauds surrounding it. Later retellings, particularly in the sensationalist press of the early 20th century, described hidden torture chambers, trapdoors, acid vats, stretching racks, and elaborate gas systems designed to suffocate guests. Careful historical investigation, however, has shown that most of these claims cannot be verified. Court filings, contractor testimony, and property records describe a poorly built, irregular, and frequently remodeled building, but none document a professionally designed labyrinth of death traps. Investigators in the 1890s certainly searched the property, and while they found odd rooms, chutes, and furnaces consistent with Holmes's fraudulent practices, such as hidden storage for stolen goods or spaces meant for quick remodeling, they did not uncover the intricate mechanisms described in later accounts. Adam Selzer, one of the most thorough modern historians on Holmes, has emphasized that the torture chamber version of the castle is almost entirely a product of myth-making. The building was mysterious because of Holmes's constant half-finished schemes and lawsuits, not because it was an engineered killing factory. Another enduring myth involved the world's Columbian Exposition. Popular retellings often suggest that Holmes constructed his hotel to lure fair visitors, then murdered them by the dozens. In truth, very little evidence supports this. The building was not completed or operated as a functioning hotel during the fair. Most of Holmes's proven crimes involve people he knew personally, business associates, mistresses, or members of the Pitzel family, not anonymous fairgoers. While it's possible that he killed others whose disappearances were never traced back to him, the idea of hundreds of fair visitors vanishing without a trace is unsupported by any contemporary records. The Pitzel case remains the only aspect of Holmes's crimes that stands on firm, evidentiary ground. The autopsy reports, Geyer's documentation, and Holmes's conviction in Philadelphia provide certainty there. The broader legend, scores of missing guests, gas chambers, acid baths, was built primarily after his execution, when journalists filled gaps with speculation and invented detail. Some of this was intentional sensationalism. Newspapers in the 1890s were fiercely competitive and new lurid headlines sold copies. Some came from Holmes himself, who seemed to relish inflating his own image. After Holmes was hanged in May 1896, the myths only grew. Stories circulated that his execution had been botched, that his neck had not broken properly, or even that he had somehow escaped. These rumors had no basis in official records. Witnesses, including reporters and prison officials, confirmed his death. Later exhumations in the 20th and 21st centuries confirmed his remains were indeed buried in Philadelphia's Holy Cross Cemetery. The legend of H. Holmes as America's first serial killer was largely cemented not in the 19th century but in the 20th, particularly through sensationalized books, pulp magazines, and eventually Erik Larson's 2003 bestseller The Devil in the White City. While Larson's work helped reintroduce Holmes to popular consciousness, historians note that it blurred fact and dramatic reconstruction, reinforcing myths about the castle and the World's Fair that remain difficult to dispel. What can be said with certainty is this: Holmes was a con man of extraordinary skill, a murderer whose verified victims include Benjamin Pitzel and 3 of his children, and almost certainly several others among his mistresses and associates. His crimes exposed the vulnerabilities of an America where police coordination across states was rudimentary and fraud was easy to perpetrate in a rapidly urbanizing society. Beyond that, much of what the public knows about Holmes is exaggeration, legend, or outright fiction layered on top of the real, documented horrors. After Holmes was executed on May 7, 1896, at Moyamensing Prison in Philadelphia, his body was buried in Holy Cross Cemetery according to his own unusual request. He asked to be interred in a coffin filled with cement, placed in a grave 10 feet deep, and covered again with cement. Holmes claimed this was to prevent grave robbers from digging up his body for dissection, a real concern at the time given his notoriety and his own history of involvement with medical schools and cadaver supply schemes. Records confirm that this request was carried out. Contemporary newspaper coverage of his execution included conflicting details. Some reporters claimed his neck did not snap cleanly and that he strangled slowly for 15 to 20 minutes. Others reported that death came quickly. What is consistent across all official accounts is that Holmes was declared dead. His remains were buried under heavy cement, and authorities had no doubt the man executed was indeed H. Holmes. Despite this, rumors circulated almost immediately that he had faked his death and escaped. By the early 20th century, urban legends suggested he had bribed officials, used a double, or otherwise evaded execution. None of these claims had evidence, and no official report from prison staff or investigators supported them. They were fueled by Holmes's own reputation for deception and the extraordinary public fascination with his case. A major clarification came more than a century later. In 2017, descendants of Holmes petitioned for the exhumation of his remains to address rumors that he had escaped. The Archdiocese of Philadelphia and a team of researchers from the University of Pennsylvania performed the exhumation under court order. The body was found encased in cement, just as records had stated. Due to the preservation effects of the cement, parts of the body were unusually intact, including Holmes's clothing and mustache. DNA analysis confirmed that the remains were indeed those of Herman Webster Mudgett, better known as H. Holmes. The rumors of escape were conclusively disproven. The Englewood building itself, the so-called murder castle, continued to draw attention after Holmes's death. In 1895, before his execution, police investigations had made the property notorious. But in 1895 and 1896, newspapers repeatedly published highly sensationalized descriptions of the building, exaggerating its hidden passages and inventing torture devices that were never proven to exist. In 1895, the building suffered a fire under suspicious circumstances. Arson was suspected, though no definitive culprit was identified. The structure continued to stand, partially damaged, until it was eventually torn down in 1938. Today, a U.S. Postal Service building occupies the lot at 63rd and Wallace. Official records, court filings, inquest testimony, police investigations show that Holmes was guilty of a specific and limited set of murders, primarily the Pitzel family. Beyond that, while it is almost certain he killed additional individuals, such as Julia and Pearl Connor, Emmeline Sigrand, and Minnie Williams, the total number of his victims will likely never be known. What is clear is that there is no evidence for the hundreds of victims that newspapers claimed in the wake of his trial. This discrepancy between official documentation and public narrative is one of the most striking aspects of Holmes's legacy. Court records show a con man and murderer whose crimes, while horrifying, were grounded in financial fraud, betrayal, and targeted killings. Public mythology, however, transformed him into a near-supernatural monster presiding over an engineered house of death. The truth lies in between. Holmes was neither the bumbling swindler of some early dismissals nor the near-mythical figure of later retellings. He was a calculating and dangerous man who thrived in the gaps of late 19th century law enforcement, leaving behind both real victims and a long trail of invented ones. By the early 20th century, pulp magazines, crime anthologies, and later popular histories kept amplifying the legends. Each retelling exaggerated the scale of Holmes's crimes, often repeating earlier mistakes or outright fabrications. When Erik Larson's The Devil in the White City was published in 2003, it brought Holmes back into public consciousness on a global scale. While Larson's book was based on significant research and helped renew interest in the history of both Holmes and the World's Fair, it also dramatized aspects of the story, and some readers took its reconstructed scenes as literal fact. This blending of official truth and public myth has made Holmes one of the most enduring figures in American crime history. But the verified record, his trial for the Pitzel murder, his confession with admitted falsehoods, the exhumation confirming his death, and the financial fraud that defined much of his life, remains the core of what we can say with certainty. People who actually encountered Holmes often left impressions that were very different from the monstrous figure later imagined. Neighbors in Englewood, for example, generally regarded him as polite, soft-spoken, and respectable. He was known as Dr. H. Holmes, a title he claimed from his short-lived medical background, and he projected an air of professionalism. This respectable exterior was part of what allowed him to continue his schemes unnoticed for so long. Contractors and workers who had dealings with Holmes described him as difficult and often untrustworthy. Testimonies given in lawsuits reveal that he frequently failed to pay his bills and changed construction plans abruptly, leaving behind unpaid debts and unfinished work. Some of these men later recalled the strange layout of the Englewood building, narrow hallways, odd staircases, and walled-off rooms. But it is important to note that their observations were framed in terms of confusion and suspicion about fraud, not torture chambers. They believed Holmes was avoiding payment or concealing stolen goods, not building death traps. Among those most directly affected were Holmes's mistresses and business associates. Several women who lived with him, such as Julia Connor, Emmeline Sigrand, and Minnie Williams, disappeared under circumstances that strongly suggest Holmes killed them. Surviving relatives later identified Holmes as the last person known to be with these women. Yet no living witness ever testified to seeing Holmes actually commit these murders, which is why the Pitzel case became the central focus of the trial. There, the evidence was indisputable. Neighbors of Holmes in Englewood remembered the presence of women and children who seemed to vanish from the house over the years. But because Chicago was a city full of transient residents in the 1890s, disappearances were not always investigated. Some recollections, recorded in later interviews, mentioned foul smells coming from the building or unusual deliveries, though these were anecdotal and not confirmed in court records. The most compelling human account tied to Holmes's crimes came from Detective Frank Geyer, who pursued the missing Pitzel children across multiple states in 1895. His detailed notes, later published in his book The Holmes Pitzel Case, provide first-hand descriptions of the search. Rented houses that Holmes had briefly occupied with the children, neighbors who recalled seeing him with them, and ultimately the grisly discoveries of their bodies. Neighbors in Indianapolis and Toronto later testified to seeing Holmes accompanied by children matching their descriptions. These testimonies directly linked Holmes to the crime and were central to his conviction. Survivors who had once trusted Holmes often described a sense of betrayal when his crimes were revealed. Business partners realized they had been swindled out of money. Families who had rented rooms in his building were shocked by the news of his arrest. The contrast between the mild-mannered, intelligent man they thought they knew and the murderer reported in the papers was startling. At the trial itself, courtroom observers noted Holmes's calm demeanor. Reporters repeatedly commented on his composure, even charm, in the face of damning testimony. This self-control, combined with his willingness to lie convincingly, left an impression on jurors and the public alike. One Philadelphia reporter remarked that Holmes showed the coolness of a man who had spent his life in deceit. Holmes's written confession before execution also provides a kind of human account, though one filled with lies. He claimed to be possessed by Satan, admitted to murders later proven false, and exaggerated his total victim count. Contemporary readers, however, were not all convinced. Some reporters openly stated that the confession was unreliable and clearly designed to enhance his notoriety. The neighbors' and eyewitnesses' recollections consistently paint Holmes as manipulative but outwardly normal, a man able to blend into society with alarming ease. They did not see a public monster but rather a deceptive professional who operated in private. Only in retrospect, after the discovery of his crimes, did suspicions about his behavior, unpaid debts, sudden disappearances, odd construction, become more sinister in meaning. These accounts reveal the essential contradiction at the heart of Holmes's story. He was simultaneously a con man whose crimes relied on being trusted, and a murderer whose victims vanished largely without witnesses. What the public came to believe after his death, the castle filled with traps and mass killings, was not what his contemporaries described. Instead, the human witnesses of his time described a man who wore respectability as a mask while exploiting the vulnerabilities of everyone around him. One of the largest discrepancies in the Holmes case lies in the number of his alleged victims. Contemporary newspapers in 1894 to 1896 reported wildly different figures, ranging from 9 to over 200. This was partly driven by sensational journalism during the Yellow Press era, when shocking crime stories sold papers. Official court records, however, dealt only with one confirmed murder, that of Benjamin Pitzel. The Philadelphia jury convicted Holmes of that killing, though investigators at the time were convinced he was also responsible for the deaths of Pitzel's children. Police investigations in Chicago did uncover evidence linking Holmes to missing women associated with him, including Julia and Pearl Connor, Emmeline Sigrand, and Minnie Williams. Yet none of these cases advanced to trial because evidence was circumstantial, and in the 1890s it was far more difficult to prove murder without eyewitnesses or a body. Official police reports acknowledge suspicion but stop short of definitive conclusions. Newspapers, by contrast, quickly transformed suspicion into certainty, reporting these disappearances as proven murders. Another discrepancy concerns the so-called murder castle. Police reports after Holmes's arrest described the Englewood building as irregular, with strange partitions, stairways leading nowhere, and hidden rooms. Investigators believed Holmes used these features to conceal stolen property, support his insurance frauds, and possibly entrap victims. However, newspapers amplified this into tales of torture chambers, acid vats, trapdoors, and iron cages. While later searches did find bones and charred remains in the basement, none were definitively identified as belonging to known victims. Official investigators never confirmed the existence of elaborate torture devices. That detail emerged almost entirely from press imagination and was repeated in later retellings until it became embedded in public memory. Court records also reveal a discrepancy between Holmes's confession and verified facts. In his 1896 confession, Holmes claimed to have killed 27 people, but investigators quickly proved that many of those individuals were alive. For example, several victims listed by Holmes came forward after his statement was published. Officials concluded that Holmes had inflated his numbers to enhance his notoriety, a finding that directly contradicted the lurid headlines circulating at the time. The way Holmes's execution was reported also demonstrates conflicting accounts. Some official witnesses stated that Holmes died quickly after the trap was sprung. Others claimed he strangled slowly for nearly 20 minutes, which became the dominant narrative in the press. These differing accounts were never fully reconciled, though modern historians suggest that slow strangulation was common with poorly conducted hangings in the 19th century, meaning the longer reports may not have been exaggerated. Even the fate of the castle building itself became wrapped in conflicting narratives. After the 1895 fire, official reports documented damage to the top floors, with investigators concluding arson was probable. Newspapers, however, often portrayed the fire as an attempt by Holmes's accomplices to destroy evidence, though no such accomplices were ever proven to exist. When the building was finally demolished in 1938, official city records listed it simply as an outdated and deteriorating property, but popular memory cast it as the destruction of a house of horrors. Later discrepancies arose when historians revisited Holmes's case. Some mid-20th century crime anthologies repeated the 200-victim claim without citing sources, relying instead on earlier sensational papers. By contrast, researchers who examined trial transcripts, inquest records, and police reports found that only a handful of deaths could be directly linked to Holmes, and only one was legally proven. The largest single clarification of official discrepancies came in 2017 with the exhumation of Holmes's remains. For decades, rumors persisted that he had escaped execution. Contemporary prison records and burial documents had always maintained he was buried in Philadelphia. The DNA testing performed on the exhumed body confirmed the official version and eliminated the possibility of escape. Yet the persistence of the rumor showed how deeply the discrepancies between official documentation and public imagination had shaped Holmes's legacy. In sum, the official record, court filings, police investigations, inquest transcripts, presents Holmes as a fraudster and murderer with a limited but real set of victims, primarily tied to the Pitzel case and likely several missing women. Newspapers and later writers expanded this into a legend of hundreds of murders and a castle of horrors. The gap between those two accounts, official restraint and public exaggeration, remains one of the most important aspects of studying Holmes's history. Investigators who chased H. Holmes found themselves working inside the forensic world of the 1890s, a world that could be painstakingly careful in one moment and embarrassingly primitive in the next. The techniques available, the institutional practices in place, and the legal rules under which police and coroners operated shaped what could be proved and what could remain only suspicion. Those technical realities help explain how Holmes could run his schemes for years and why only a handful of deaths tied to him were ever legally established. Medical and forensic science at the time had some real strengths but also clear limits. Coroners and medical examiners could perform autopsies, note obvious trauma, and, in many cases, identify burns, fractures, or signs of asphyxia. Chemical tests existed for certain poisons. Arsenic could be detected by the Marsh test, for example, so toxicology was not entirely absent. But toxicology as a reliable, broad discipline was still developing. Tests for volatile compounds like chloroform were far less sensitive and more subjective than modern methods. Analysts could sometimes detect residues or tell by smell that a person had been exposed to anesthetics, but those findings were weaker evidence than police and prosecutors would later demand. In the Pitzel case, medical testimony about incapacitation before burning played a central role, but in other suspected Holmes crimes the absence of a body or of clear toxicological proof meant no criminal charge could follow. Identification science was also primitive by modern standards. There was no DNA analysis, no centralized fingerprint database, and no national missing person registry. Fingerprinting as a routine identification tool in U.S. law enforcement had not yet been widely adopted. The technique was spreading in Europe and would only gain broad use in American police departments in the first decade of the 20th century. Dental identification existed in basic form, and comparative anatomy could sometimes match fragments or skeletons to person-specific features, but methods were laborious and uncertain. When remains were recovered, skeletons in Toronto or charred fragments in Indianapolis, investigators relied on clothing, personal effects, and documentary traces to establish identity. Those forms of evidence could be persuasive, but they were inherently circumstantial and left room for contest. Procedural and institutional constraints mattered as much as scientific limits. Policing was highly local. Sheriffs, municipal police forces, and coroners answered to local authorities, and there was no routine mechanism for rapid cross-jurisdictional information sharing. Detectives like Frank Geyer bridged that gap by following receipts, railroad stubs, hotel registers, and telegrams. His painstaking ledger-based work compensated for the absence of federal databases. Geyer's method, assemble receipts, date stamp movements, interview clerks and landlords, was in many ways state-of-the-art policing for the time, and it produced the documentary evidence that linked Holmes to movements and locations where bodies were later found. But the method depended on small business record-keeping and human memory. If a clerk had thrown out a register or a train conductor failed to keep a stub, that link could vanish. Chain of custody practices and evidentiary standards were less formalized than they would become. Police inventories recorded items seized from Holmes's properties, but cataloging and preserving evidence followed ad hoc protocols. Items were sometimes handled by multiple people, and preservation of fragile material, charred bone, small textiles was imperfect. When remains reached medical schools, those institutions sometimes purchased skeletons through intermediaries. A market in cadavers and anatomical specimens existed and was notorious enough that Holmes himself expressed fear of grave robbing. That market helps explain why some remains could be dispersed, sold, or reburied without leaving a clear forensic trail back to a particular crime. The legal environment amplified these technical limits. Prosecutors rightly sought evidence that would survive cross-examination. A reliably identified body, a clear cause of death, witnesses who could place a suspect at the scene. In many cases connected to Holmes, prosecutors had motive and opportunity plus suspicious circumstantial facts, but lacked the kind of forensic certainty juries required. The Pitzel prosecution was an exception because it combined a convincing autopsy, corroborating witness testimony, and Geyer's documentary trail. In contrast, the many women who were last seen with Holmes, whose disappearance fueled the murder castle legend, left insufficient physical evidence for indictments in Chicago. Civil suits and creditor actions could proceed on weaker proof, which is why an abundance of Holmes's fraudulent behavior shows up in court records, even where homicide charges do not. Technology for scene preservation and investigation was also limited. Fire scenes posed particular difficulty. The heat that destroyed potential evidence also altered or obliterated forensic markers. Investigators in the Pittsville and Indianapolis scenes had to interpret charred remains without modern methods for differentiating thermal destruction from postmortem burning or for detecting subtle biochemical residues. Where a modern lab might run microscopic and chemical assays, late 19th century coroners relied on gross pathology and the testimony of medical experts whose tools and consensus were still forming. The role of private agencies and of journalism mattered as well. Pinkerton operatives and private detectives filled gaps between municipal forces, bringing investigative savvy but also agendas. Newspapers, meanwhile, often ran sensational copy that conflated verified evidence with rumor. That frenzy sometimes pressured police to act quickly, but also smeared investigative clarity with public hysteria. Holmes's own willingness to lie, boast, and manipulate reporters added an extra layer of confusion. His false confessions and outrageous claims complicated the job of separating reliable technical evidence from his fabrications. Finally, preservation of records itself proved a limiting factor for later historians. Many municipal documents, ledgers, and small court files from the 1890s have been lost, misfiled, or remain fragmented. That archival incompleteness means some questions about Holmes's activities may never be fully answered because the documentary traces that would settle them no longer exist. The exhumation and DNA confirmation of Holmes's grave in the 21st century resolved one long-running rumor, but it stands as an exception. Modern science could answer only one narrow question of identity long after the original crimes and investigations. For most of the contested disappearances, the technical realities of the 1890s, primitive toxicology, fragile identification methods, decentralized policing, and imperfect records, are why suspicion could be strong without becoming conviction. Holmes's crimes, unlike those of many later serial killers, were documented largely through the people who encountered him. Neighbors, employees, creditors, detectives, journalists, and jurors. Their accounts, filtered through sworn testimony, depositions, newspaper reports, and memoirs, provide the closest glimpse into how he operated and how he was perceived. Taken together, these voices build the human landscape around the hard facts of fraud, disappearance, and murder. Residents of Englewood, where Holmes built his strange three-story structure, remembered him as outwardly polite but vaguely elusive. Shopkeepers who rented space on the ground floor later told reporters that their landlord was attentive to rent collection but kept his upper floors locked and rarely explained their purpose. Employees who worked briefly inside the building described confusing staircases, rooms without windows, and odd renovations that never seemed to reach completion. Some testified to assisting in the installation of gas lines or secret panels but admitted they could not see the final purpose. Many left after short employment, citing Holmes's habit of withholding wages or shifting responsibilities. Their accounts, preserved in affidavits and newspaper interviews, painted him as a figure who seemed respectable on the surface but provoked unease once his promises proved unreliable. Neighbors recalled young women arriving to board at Holmes's rooms, then departing suddenly or never seen again. At the time, women seeking work in Chicago often had little family oversight, and sudden disappearances did not automatically trigger police action. But clerks, shop assistants, and acquaintances gave statements years later that they had noticed trunks left behind or sudden silences from lodgers. These recollections, though circumstantial, fed into the impression of a man whose domestic arrangements were punctuated by unexplained vanishing. The case of Benjamin Pittsville brought more detailed human testimony into court. Pittsville's widow, Carrie, testified about her husband's dealings with Holmes and his promise of financial opportunity. She described how Holmes persuaded her to allow 3 of her children, Alice, Nellie, and Howard, to travel with him, a decision she would later bitterly regret. Carrie's testimony was supported by her surviving children, who recounted the journeys across several cities before Holmes separated them. Alice and Nellie's bodies were discovered in Toronto, and Howard's remains in Indianapolis, each location linked back through receipts, hotel ledgers, and statements from landlords and neighbors. Landladies in both cities gave vivid testimony. They had seen Holmes with children, noticed his insistence on privacy, and remembered trunks that emitted a foul odor after he departed. These accounts became crucial in reconstructing the timeline of the children's final days. Detective Frank Geyer's pursuit of the missing Pitzel children produced a narrative that later appeared in his published account. His investigation depended not only on documents but on the willingness of everyday people, ticket agents, lodging house operators, neighbors, to recall interactions. Clerks identified Holmes in registers. Children remembered playing briefly with Alice and Nellie. A neighbor in Indianapolis testified to seeing Holmes with a young boy matching Howard's description. Geyer's notes record both the cooperative spirit of many witnesses and the practical difficulty of assembling a reliable trail in an age without photographs widely distributed across law enforcement. In the courtroom, medical experts provided their perspective. The Philadelphia coroner and physicians who examined Benjamin Pitzel's body testified that chloroform had likely been applied after he was incapacitated, contradicting Holmes's claim that Pitzel had died accidentally during a fraudulent scheme. Their technical testimony, though limited by the toxicology of the time, gave the jury a scientific anchor. Other physicians were called to comment on remains found in Toronto and Indianapolis, identifying them as consistent with the missing children. These expert accounts balanced the circumstantial nature of other witness statements. Reporters played a dual role, both recording and shaping public understanding. Journalists interviewed anyone who had crossed paths with Holmes, from hotel porters to former creditors. Some accounts were embellished for sensational headlines, but sworn testimony under oath preserved the more reliable recollections. Still, the press frenzy created an atmosphere in which rumor and fact often blurred. Holmes himself contributed to that blur by granting interviews in which he shifted stories, denied certain charges, or hinted at others, forcing investigators to separate deliberate misdirection from possible admissions. Holmes's own words, whether in testimony or in his later confession, represent another category of human account. He alternated between cooperation and obfuscation, sometimes admitting to frauds while denying murders, then later claiming dozens of killings that could not be substantiated. Court observers described him as calm, articulate, even charming, which contrasted sharply with the charges. Those who saw him in custody often commented on his composure and on his apparent enjoyment of manipulating his audience, whether detectives or reporters. His conflicting statements remain one of the central challenges in distinguishing fact from fabrication. Finally, the jurors who sat through his trial and the spectators who filled the courtroom left impressions recorded in newspapers. They described an orderly process dominated by documentary evidence and the sorrowful testimony of the Pitzel family. Their verdict, finding Holmes guilty of murder, rested not on speculation about dozens of victims, but on the demonstrable facts of one killing, supported by witnesses whose voices anchored the prosecution's case. These human accounts, scattered across police files, court transcripts, memoirs, and newspapers, form the connective tissue between Holmes's frauds and the deaths tied to him. They illustrate the gap between suspicion and proof. Many spoke of unease, rumor, or vanished companions, but only in the Pitzel case did witness testimony, documentary evidence, and medical findings align sufficiently for conviction. The trial of H. Holmes began in Philadelphia in October 1895. He was charged with the murder of Benjamin Pitzel, a case chosen because it presented the strongest, most direct evidence. The prosecution, led by District Attorney George Graham, built its case on testimony from the Pitzel family, detectives, medical experts, and a paper trail of receipts, leases, and letters that tracked Holmes's movements. In court, Holmes maintained his composure. Observers described him as calm, polite, even courteous toward his accusers. He dressed well, spoke clearly, and at times seemed to relish the attention. The jury, however, heard damning testimony. Carrie Pitzel recounted her husband's dealings with Holmes and her devastating decision to entrust 3 of her children to him. Detective Frank Geyer described his search that led to the discovery of the children's remains. Physicians testified that Pitzel's death could not have been accidental. The chloroform had been applied deliberately after he was unconscious, suggesting murder rather than mishap. The defense attempted to cast doubt on the forensic conclusions, arguing that the chemical evidence was uncertain and that Pitzel had been a willing participant in the fraudulent insurance scheme. But the cumulative weight of documents, eyewitness accounts, and expert testimony was overwhelming. After only a few hours of deliberation, the jury found Holmes guilty of first-degree murder. Holmes appealed, but his conviction was upheld. The legal process then turned to sentencing. On November 30th, 1895, the court sentenced him to death by hanging. Even after the sentence, Holmes continued to manipulate the press. He gave interviews from prison and, in 1896, produced a lengthy confession for publication. In it, he claimed to have killed more than 24 people, sometimes offering names, sometimes vague descriptions. Investigators quickly determined that many of the supposed victims were alive and well. Historians now view this confession as a mixture of truth, exaggeration, and fabrication. Holmes's final effort to control the narrative and profit from notoriety. His execution took place on May 7, 1896, at Moyamensing Prison in Philadelphia. Reporters and officials attended. Holmes remained composed to the end, speaking calmly before the noose was placed around his neck. Accounts note that the hanging did not proceed smoothly. His neck did not break instantly, and he was pronounced dead after roughly 20 minutes. Holmes's body was buried in Holy Cross Cemetery in Philadelphia. In accordance with his wishes, his coffin was encased in cement, a precaution he requested to prevent grave robbing. Over a century later, in 2017, his remains were exhumed at the request of his descendants to settle a rumor that he had escaped execution. Forensic analysis, including dental records, confirmed that the body was indeed Holmes. He had not escaped. The legacy of H. Holmes has grown far beyond the facts of his trial. Contemporary newspapers, eager for sensational stories, described his Englewood building as a murder castle, filled with trapdoors, gas chambers, and hidden passages. While the building did contain oddly designed rooms and secretive construction, much of the most lurid detail was invented or exaggerated by the press. Later writers expanded these tales, sometimes crediting him with hundreds of murders. Careful historical research, drawing on court records, census data, and verified disappearances, suggests that Holmes killed far fewer people, possibly 9, certainly several, but not the hundreds of legend. What is undisputed is that Holmes was a skilled fraudster, a manipulator of people and systems, and a man who murdered for both profit and convenience. His crimes combined financial swindling with lethal violence, leaving behind grieving families and shocked investigators. The myths that surround him reflect both the horror of his confirmed acts and the public's appetite for sensational crime stories at the end of the 19th century. With his execution, Holmes's direct story ended, but his name entered American criminal history as one of its earliest and most infamous multiple murderers. His case remains a reminder of how fraud, charisma, and violence can intersect, and of how legend can overtake fact when newspapers and later storytellers amplify fear beyond the record of the courts. More than a century later, the story of H. Holmes still lingers between fact and legend, part history, part mystery, and forever unsettling. Whether he was a cunning fraudster or something far darker, his name endures as one of America's most chilling figures. You've been watching Eternal Obsidian. Subscribe for more journeys into the shadows of history.